Hello and welcome to another edition of Community Forum. My name is Joseph Feaster. I am the host of the program. And if you're noticing, I'm not my usual bubbly, smiling self because the topic that I'm going to be discussing with my guest today is one which is very disconcerting. It is sad. It is almost infuriating as I read through some of the material that my guest provided for me in preparation for this particular program. And I'm referring to a situation or a history which talked about how the government, by its policies, segregated America. And I want to first show you the book that I have. It's called The Color of Law. It's by my guest, Richard Rothstein. And I suggest to you, if you are a human being and want to know about the history that went on in this country in doing things that related to what were done to certain persons in this population, it would be a great and riveting book to read. But let me introduce and to welcome my guest, Richard Rothstein. He's here with me by Skype. He's in California. So Richard, hello to you.
Hello, how are you?
I am well from the standpoint of seeing you. Hopefully it's warmer out there than it is here in Boston. But I wanted to, as I said at the top of the program, it's difficult for me to be my bubbly self because of the content of what you have educated me on through your book, The Color of Law. But before we get into the specifics, I'd like to at least have our viewing audience know a little bit about you. Richard Rothstein is a leading authority on housing policy. In his book that I just showed you, The Color of Law, he chronicles de jure discrimination and racial zoning beginning in the 1920s. And we'll have definitions, so by the time you leave this program, get your paper and pencil out, you will have an understanding of some legal principles as well. He talks about in this book how the police and prosecutors brutally upheld the standards of racial discrimination and racial zoning. He is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute. He is a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And in California, he is the fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a man who knows what he's talking about, has done the research. I want to welcome you, Richard, to Community Forum.
Thank you very much.
Your book is so full of information that, I really could, by the time I finished about 3 chapters, I had 3 pages of notes, and we won't be able to cover them all. Otherwise, I would have to go home, you would have to go home, you would have to take a break, and we'd have to come back. But I would like you first, so we can define for our viewing audience, I want to get some definitions, because even in your preface, you talked about a few things on why you might use the terminology ghetto and what that meant. You talked about redlining. You talked about de facto. You talked about de jure. And I'll stop there because then I'll go through the amendments. Why don't you enlighten our audience, as however you wish to proceed, on how you utilize those words, what they mean, and you can tie it specifically to some of what you wrote about in the book as well.
Well, all right, I'll start with de facto and de jure. You know, we in this country abolished segregation in the mid-20th century in almost every area of American life. We abolished it in education. We abolished it in transportation, on buses, in water fountains, in schools. But we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. And we ignore it. We accept it as something that's normal, that's natural. Despite our commitment to abolish segregation, we've done nothing to try to undo the segregation of every metropolitan area. And that's where these terms that you were referring to come in. What the Supreme Court has said is that if segregation was caused by purely private activity, by private prejudice, by people wanting to live with others of the same race, maybe because African Americans don't have enough money to live in middle-class neighborhoods, all of these private activities. If that's the reason that we have residential segregation, there's nothing we can do about it. Because if something happened by accident, it has to unhappen by accident. On the contrary, If segregation was caused by government policy, law, regulation, then it's unconstitutional, and we're obligated to do something about it. Well, the court calls segregation by accident de facto segregation. It's a term we all are familiar with, we all use, and we explain the segregation throughout the country as being de facto segregation. The term that the court uses for government created and enforced segregation is de jure segregation. That can be remedied, de facto segregation can't. The point of my book, let me just finish this one sentence.
Please,
The point of my book is that because we believe that segregation across the country is de facto, we do nothing about it. In fact, in reality, government created segregation and enforced segregation. The reason we have segregated communities across the country is not because of private activity, although certainly some private activity was involved, but it was mainly because of government policy. It was very explicit, very open, everybody knew about it, and we've forgotten this history. So we misleadingly characterize the segregation of metropolitan areas as de facto, when in fact it's government sponsored.
We're going to explore that in greater depth as we go through the program, but I also wanted to be helpful because you made references to 3 amendments and also a Civil Rights Act. You talked about how the Fifth Amendment played into this situation, the 13th Amendment, Sections 1 and 2, the 14th Amendment, and the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which abolished slavery, but as you indicated, the Supreme Court overturned that or found that it did not, based upon what you just said, de facto versus de jure discrimination. Could you talk a little bit about those 3 amendments and how that Civil Rights Act played into your writings?
Sure. It's widely accepted, I don't think there's any dispute about it, that the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution requires the federal government to treat all citizens equally and fairly. And so when the government enacts laws and policies designed to segregate communities, that violates the Fifth Amendment. And later on in the program, I hope we'll have a chance to talk about many of these federal government policies that created segregation and discriminated against African American home buyers and renters. It's also widely accepted that the 14th Amendment prohibits state and local governments from doing the same. And state and local governments also, throughout the 20th century, added to federal policy by adopting explicit policies required to segregate metropolitan areas. The 13th Amendment is a little bit less well known. Everybody understands that it emancipated slaves. But Section 2 of the 13th Amendment required Congress to enact policies to, in effect, abolish the consequences of slavery, second-class citizenship of all kinds. Congress did so in 1866, as you mentioned. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which said that in order to fully emancipate slaves, we had to prohibit, among many other things, discrimination in housing, interference with African Americans' right to buy and rent housing on an equal basis with whites. In 1883, the Supreme Court prohibited the enforcement of that amendment, saying that it had gone too far, that Congress had no right to prohibit housing discrimination, and that maintained as federal government policy until 1968, when finally the Supreme Court recognized that it had been wrong in 1883, that Congress had a perfect right and obligation under the 13th Amendment to abolish housing discrimination because it was a form of second-class citizenship. It was a residue of slavery. And therefore, in order to fully implement the 13th Amendment, we had to abolish housing discrimination. But for those 102 years, between 1866 and 1868, the federal, state, and local governments persistently enforced policies that were designed to maintain African Americans in a second-class status, not fully emancipating them from slavery, not eliminating what the court called the badges and incidents of slavery, and the government enforced housing segregation in every metropolitan area in the country.
So just to underscore that and to emphasize it for the viewing audience, basically what we're going to point out is that racial segregation became a national policy. It was a national system that existed because of the federal policy, the inadequacy of a judicial remedy because of the findings by the Supreme Court. And in essence, we are, as Richard Rothstein has just said, this continued on until 1968 when we got into the Lyndon Johnson era and the Fair Housing Act. But I want to walk through a bit. We started out, or your book started out speaking about Richmond, Virginia, and the Rottingwood Project. Can you talk about you've just presented in terms of the legal precepts, the practices that were taken by both federal and state governments, but now we're going to be talking about the implementation of that, the illustration of that. Can you talk about Richmond, Virginia, and the circumstances there with that, the Ford Motor Company, USO, Rothingham Project?
Okay, well, excuse me, Joseph, but I need to correct you a bit.
Okay.
It was Richmond, California, not Richmond,
Oh,
Virginia.
Richmond, oh, California. Thank you. Okay.
As
I'm sure Virginia would be
know,
happy that I took them off the list.
Well, I think there are other cases where you could put them back on the list, but the example you're talking about was from Richmond, California. As you probably know, and most of your viewers know, during World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production in order to take jobs because there were no jobs available in the Depression. And it was World War II and the production of planes and tanks and jeeps that brought employment back to the country, full employment back to the country. One of the areas that was a booming area of defense production was the San Francisco Bay Area. And there's a community just north of Berkeley, a suburb of Berkeley, called Richmond, which was the center of shipbuilding on the West Coast during World War II. The Kaiser shipyards built 5 shipyards on the San Francisco Bay in Richmond, California. And 100,000 workers flocked to that Richmond area in order to take jobs in the defense industry. The government had to provide housing for these workers. Richmond, at the beginning of World War II, was a tiny community of about 20,000 families. People rather. By the end of the war, it grew to 100,000 in population. It's unfathomable how a community can grow from 20,000 to 100,000 in just 4 years. But the government had to somehow find housing for all the workers who were working in the shipyards, because otherwise the ships wouldn't roll off into the bay. And you mentioned there was also a Ford Motor plant that was making tanks and jeeps. Somehow housing had to be found for these workers who came there, and there were white workers and black workers who came to Richmond. Richmond had been an all-white community. There were a few African Americans living there working as domestic servants. They were living actually outside Richmond working as domestic servants for white families, but it was a white community. The government built housing for these war workers and segregated it. They built separate housing for African Americans along the railroad tracks in the industrial area, shoddy housing. They built much more stable housing in white areas for white workers. It was explicitly designated by race. And they created segregation in the community that otherwise would never have known it because there was no segregation before. There were no African American workers living in this area before World War II. So the segregation that the government created by these policies determined the racial makeup and the design, the racial boundaries of Richmond for decades to come. One of the things that the government did was it financed private builders to build housing for war workers. The suburb that you're talking about just outside Richmond, called Rollingwood, was financed by the Federal Housing Administration, subsidized by them, for white workers only. African Americans were prohibited to live in it. The government also required that the developers, like the developer of Rollingwood, include a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale or rental to African Americans. The government required the homes in Rollingwood to have a separate entrance with a kind of small kitchen unit for war workers who weren't married, so that additional workers could be housed, but that was also restricted to white workers.
Wasn't that called the War Guest Program? Was that the War Guest Program, Richard?
That's correct. That's correct. So these two policies that the federal government followed in Richmond, and of course in every community in the country with defense plants, created segregation that otherwise wouldn't have existed. On the one hand, government created housing that was explicitly segregated. On the other hand, government subsidized private housing that was restricted to whites only, from which African Americans were excluded, and where sale, resale, or rental to African Americans was prohibited.
You talk about in that Richmond, California discussion as well, the Ford Motor Company and the policies that they had, because what the correlation that I found in reading your book was that housing and jobs are connected, and by this policy had an effect upon African Americans having an ability to be employed. And the Ford Motor Company, in terms of its policies, may illustrate that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the Ford Motor Company before World War II had a sign out in front saying that colored and Mexican is not wanted. So African Americans couldn't get homes in the Ford Motor plant when it was a civilian production. During World War II, they still refused to hire African Americans, but as they ran out of white workers and the tanks and the jeeps that they were building had to be built, the government required them to hire anybody who was available, and so they began hiring black workers. At the end of World War II, the Ford plant reverted to civilian production, continuing to make cars for civilians. And in 1955, as happened in many, many industrial plants across the country, they decided to move the plant out of Richmond. It had to be in Richmond initially because it was a deep water port, and that was the only way that they could get the parts they needed or ship the cars that they were building. But by 1955, the highway system was being built, and industrial facilities like the Ford plant could move to rural areas where they had much more space than if they had to be crowded in multiple stories along the port. And so the Ford plant moved from Richmond, California, to a rural community called Milpitas. It was about 50 miles away from the Richmond. They could move there because they could have a lot of land. They could have a single continuous assembly line without elevators, and there were highways leading to the plant that would enable them to ship parts, finished cars, and get parts. Well, the United Auto Workers, which at that time represented the workers at the Ford plant, negotiated an agreement allowing all workers in the Ford plant to transfer to the new plant in Milpitas. This is the Silicon Valley area. The white workers could transfer, but the black workers couldn't because housing in the Milpitas area was being built by the federal government, again, by the Federal Housing Administration, only for whites. The Federal Housing Administration guaranteed bank loans for builders, for developers to create entire subdivisions for white families from which African Americans were, by federal policy, excluded. There were no homes being built in that area where African Americans could live. And so African Americans had much more difficulty transferring to the jobs in Milpitas than white workers did. A few did, but the African American workforce of the Ford plant declined when it moved to Milpitas. A few, I write about one African American worker in the Ford plant who bought a van with 8 other workers, and they took a 50-mile, one-way, 100-mile round trip commute to the Ford plant every day in order to try to keep these good jobs. But the housing policy is what kept most African Americans from being able to move to good jobs in the rural areas, because the federal government was building housing for white workers only and excluding African Americans from it.
You know, I wonder, I mean, as I said before, there was so much that was in here, but I also want to educate our viewing audience, because 2 aspects I'd like you to address now. One is that at a point in time when the government, the federal government, provided these loans so that whites could move into other housing and out of public housing, because again, I want to underscore that the public housing policies were segregated as well. This was built into the Housing and Urban Development, and that wasn't even the agency at the time. It was called something else. But nonetheless, when they did that, there were other instances of where blockbusting occurred, And then you had segregated schools because persons could only live in certain communities. Can you elaborate a little bit on both that and to educate folks on what blockbusting is and was, and how the segregated schools were created?
Well, you've got a lot of questions there.
I know. I
Let
can't
me
help it.
start.
Your book is chock full of information.
Let me start with public housing, which you referenced. The first civilian public housing in this country was built in the New Deal by the Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies that the Roosevelt administration created during the Depression. The Public Works Administration built the first civilian housing in this country, in many, many communities in the country. And again, it built it on a segregated basis, even in communities that had never known segregation before, creating a pattern of segregation that persisted for decades afterwards. So in my book, for example, I recount something that maybe you're familiar with. The great African-American poet, playwright, Langston Hughes, wrote an autobiography in which he described how in the early 20th century, he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. Now, we don't think much of urban neighborhoods like Cleveland as being integrated, but we would be surprised if we were transported back to, in the early 20th century, to cities all over the country that had integrated neighborhoods, for the simple reason that workers in factories didn't have automobiles to get to work. So if you had a plant with Irish and Italian, Czech and Jewish and African-American workers, they all had to live close enough to the factory to be able to walk to work. The other reason we had integrated neighborhoods in the early 20th century, middle 20th century, was because railroads were the major form of intercity transportation. The railroads would only hire African-Americans as baggage handlers and as Pullman car porters. So they had to live close enough to downtown to be able to walk to the railroad terminal in order to get to work. And these were generally white neighborhoods, so those neighborhoods were integrated also. Well, Langston Hughes, as I said, describes how he grew up in one of these urban Cleveland integrated neighborhoods. He said his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. That neighborhood was called the Central neighborhood of Cleveland. The Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood to build segregated housing, a separate project for blacks and whites, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed, and that helped to define the future growth of segregation in Cleveland for years to come. It's not that private prejudice didn't exist, but this was an integrated neighborhood. It may be that had the government required the two projects that it built in Cleveland to be integrated, that some white families who were prejudiced would have refused to move into them on that basis. But the housing shortage was so great that for every family that refused to move in, there would have been 10 wanting to take its place. So this was a purposeful government policy to create segregation where it hadn't previously existed. The Public Works Administration did the same thing all over the country. Cambridge, Massachusetts, we think of that as being a very liberal area. Well, the area around MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was also an integrated neighborhood, about half black and half white. In the 1930s, and the federal government demolished housing there to build segregated projects, one for African Americans, one for whites. Even Atlanta, a southern city, had integrated neighborhoods. The Flats area near downtown in Atlanta was integrated. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that area and built a project for whites only, forcing African Americans whose homes had been demolished to find housing in overcrowded other areas that were predominantly African American. So this is the way in which public housing, and this policy continued throughout the next 30 years of segregating public housing to create segregated problems in the cities. Now, you mentioned blockbusting. That's an entirely different question.
Well, let me just go back. I know I did. I want to go back because can you I don't have them in front of me, but I know you know. There were specific disqualifying factors whereby one was not able to get into public housing. And these were both mandated federally and also by the municipalities to continue the segregation. Can you articulate some of those disqualifying factors?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, but the public housing that I'm describing, and really from 1933 when the Public Works Administration started to build it, for the next 20 years, public housing was not for poor people as we think of public housing today. It was not for single mothers with children or places where young men without hope and no access to jobs lived. If you recall, and I mentioned before, that much of this public housing was being built in areas which were where jobs were close because jobs hadn't yet moved into the rural areas like the Ford plant that I described. So the public housing that was being built was for working class families who were paying the full cost of housing in their rent. These were not subsidized projects. The reason that they needed public housing was because of a housing shortage, not because they were too poor to afford housing in the private market. In fact, public housing agencies in many places, places like Boston, for example, or New York, had social workers who would visit the homes of applicants for public housing, both black and white, for the separate projects, to make sure that their children were well behaved, that the families had good enough furniture to meet the high standards of public housing before they would accept their applications. It was only later, and that's a different story, it was only 20 years later, that public housing came to be a subsidized program for poor people who were mostly a minority, mostly African American, who were concentrated in central cities. But the public housing that began was for working class families, segregated explicitly by the government, people who could afford to pay rent, who had jobs, but segregated by public policy in a way that didn't have to be done.
I'm going to come back to the question that I raised about blockbusting, but I want to stay on this public housing because I want the viewing audience to fully understand and appreciate what you said. Public housing was housing provided for working class persons because of the housing shortage, and that was both in terms of the white as well as the black public housing that was created. Later it became such, and you use terminologies as a creation of slums and of ghettos. Can you elaborate on that as to how the policy, the ability for whites to get loans to move out of the inner cities and their public housing, whereas blacks were denied the ability to get those particular loans, specifically, as well as the policies for private developers as well that they wrote in that African Americans basically need not apply. So talk about the creation of the slums or ghettos as you refer to them.
Okay, again, you're asking for a long story.
I love your stories, Richard.
It's your question. In 1949, Congress defeated a proposal that public housing should begin to be integrated, that discrimination should end in public housing. And after it did that, giant public housing towers were built across the country. Places, you're familiar with them, in Chicago, the Robert Taylor homes, or the Cabrini Green projects, or maybe some of your viewers have heard of the Pruitt-Igoe towers in St. Louis. Now, these were all, as I said, explicitly segregated. The Pruitt-Igoe towers, Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. But beginning in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, a development occurred in public. That is that large numbers of vacancies were present in the projects designed for white families, and large numbers of long waiting lists in the projects designed for African American families. African American families had to be permitted to move into the vacant white projects. The situation was so conspicuous that the government couldn't any longer maintain a situation with long waiting lists for some projects and vacancies in others. So African Americans were admitted to all public housing. Whites continued to not use public housing. The vacancies for white projects increased, and eventually the projects became all African American. And about that time, as I mentioned before, we're now talking about the early 1950s, late 1940s, industry started moving out of central cities and into rural areas in the suburbs. So there were fewer and fewer jobs, good jobs, available in the areas surrounding public housing. And so the people living in public housing, the African Americans, became poorer and poorer. And eventually the government had to subsidize the rents of families in public housing. families living in public housing had no access to good jobs any longer. And so they became, as you say, vertical slums, in which only poor people lived. The real question here, and I'm sure your viewers are probably asking, well, why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the black projects? And that's because of another federal program, not public housing, a program ran by the Federal Housing Administration. I referred to it earlier, and that is the Federal Housing Administration recruited builders of giant subdivisions everywhere in the country to create subdivisions for whites only. So we're all familiar with these subdivisions. The most famous of them is probably Levittown, east of New York City, but there were others. Maybe some of your viewers recall hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was describing a development south of San Francisco. There were hundreds of these subdivisions. The way they happened was this. Someone like Levitt in New York City, or east of New York City, could never have built a subdivision of 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. He had no money to buy the land. There was an enormous investment in construction materials. The only way he could get the financing to build the Levittown subdivision was by going to the federal government and submitting his plans for the subdivision. And if the government approved his plans, he could then take those plans, that approval, to a bank and get the financing to build a 17,000 home development. Well, in order to get that approval, Levitt had to commit to the Federal Housing Administration that he would not sell any homes to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as I said earlier, that a clause be included in the deed of every home in Levittown prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And this was done in subdivisions all across the country. The entire nation was suburbanized by a Federal Housing Administration policy designed to move white families out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs and to prevent African Americans from doing so. And that created what we call a white noose that the federal government had built around central cities, concentrating African Americans not only in public housing, but in apartment and private market apartments in central cities from which jobs were disappearing, while whites were subsidized to move into single-family homes in the suburbs. The subsidy was so great that a white family could move out of public housing. Remember, they were paying the full cost of the rent in public housing. A white family could move out of public housing into one of these Federal Housing Administration or Veterans Administration developments and pay less in their monthly charges for those mortgages, the FHA and VA mortgages that they had, including taxes and insurance, pay less in their monthly charges than they were paying for rent in public housing before they were moved out. So this policy of the Federal Housing Administration to create single-family homes for white families only, combined with the segregation policy of various public housing agencies, created the situation that we know today, where African Americans are predominantly concentrated in urban areas. Whites are concentrated in single-family homes in the suburbs, and we have a segregated nation by federal policy.
So I'm going to go to our sponsors in a moment, but I want to talk about that policy also created wealth for those individuals because they now had an asset which they own, which created wealth for many of those white families. But when we do come back, I am going to ask and have you follow up on blockbusting. We've talked about it. We'll come back to that, but for now, I want us to go to our sponsors.
Hi, it's Gary LaPierre, and the crew wants to thank Maxie's Delicatessen. That's at 117 Sharon Street in Stoughton. They're 781-341-1662. American Cancer Society, yes, they're looking for volunteers. Drive cancer patients to and from their treatments. 1-800-ACS-6662, or just go to www.cancer.org. Ilse Mark's Food Pantry in St. Anthony's Free Market, 2 Park Avenue in Stoughton. For more information, call Christine Gallagher. That's at 781-341-0611 or 781-341-0549. Meals on Wheels. Just ask for Jessica. You'll find her at 781-344-8882, extension 2. Stoughton Penny Saver. Our business is advertising your business, they tell us. 27 Rose Glen Street, Stoughton, 781-344-4833. Community Forum showtimes in Stoughton. It's Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at 6 p.m., Monday at 8 p.m., Tuesday at 5 p.m. It's on Comcast Channel 9 and Verizon Channel 28. All comments and suggestions welcome. Contact us at communityforum1@yahoo.com. Samaritans, they're at 41 West Street on the 4th floor in Boston, 02111. Their phone number is 617-536-2460. 24-hour helplines for Samaritans, and the number is 877-870-HOPE.
David and you and all.
877-870-4673. Samaritans, you can find them at 800-252-TEEN. That's 252-8336. Or find them online at SamaritansHope.org.
Well, hello to our viewing audience. If you're just tuning in, this is Community Forum. I have as my guest today Richard Rothstein, who is the author of this book. I got to remember which way to take it for the Skype. It is The Color of Law. I recommend it to you. It is an excellent historical presentation, somewhat painful, but nonetheless informative and educational. And I think every person should know the history of what transpired here in the United States as far as the government policy that segregated housing. So we've been talking about that for the period of time, and I promised Richard, I promised you that we'll come back and we'll talk about the blockbusting. Just to give you a prelude to what I want to talk about further, I want to talk about the NAACP suit in 1953, where started to say, hey, we got to end this. We're talking about what was done by Lyndon Johnson and the Fair Housing Act, and we'll go through that path. And there were even some discussions to what was talked about that folks had to leave by sundown in South Carolina. We may even get to that, but for the time being, let's give the definition of blockbusting and how it was implemented in many of the places which you wrote about.
Okay. You want to go first, though, to the creation of wealth that you were talking about earlier? You wanted to handle first?
Let's start. I mean, again, when we start, one of the things that came crystal clear to me, and almost I've always heard about the issue of reparations and understood things from the standpoint of slavery and things of that nature, but I never looked at it from the standpoint of the creation of wealth. And we're having that conversation right here now in Boston about what is the disparity in wealth between African Americans and whites. And this is almost the root of the issue, whereby government policy allowed one to be able to get the asset, which was a home, which most of us strive for, which would allow for getting the equity and allow you to advance up the economic scale. So can you talk about how that was done and then talk about blockbusting?
Sure, I will get to blockbusting, I promise.
Okay.
I mentioned a few minutes ago that the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, required builders of entire subdivisions to exclude African Americans. And I mentioned that probably the best known example is Levittown, 17,000 homes there. When white families bought those homes in the mid-20th century, they cost $8,000, $9,000 a piece. These were small homes, 750 square feet. Working class families of either race could have afforded that. That's about, less than $100,000 in today's money. It's about twice national median income, or even less. Any working class family with an FHA or VA mortgage of either race could afford to buy a home at that price. So white families bought those homes. African Americans were prohibited from buying those homes, even if they had good incomes and could afford them. White families bought those homes for $100,000 or less. But today, those homes in all of these suburbs across the country sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, sometimes even more. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations. You can do the arithmetic. $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that equity to send children to college. They used it to weather emergencies. They used it to bequeath wealth to their children so they could have down payments for homes. African Americans who were forced to live in rented apartments, prohibited from living in these subsidized single-family homes in the suburbs, gained none of that equity. The result is that today, incomes, average African American incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. But average African American wealth is only about 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity, I mean, you'd expect that if you had a 60% income ratio, you'd have a 60% wealth ratio. Families can save the same amount of money out of their incomes. But that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 20th century. And it determines the permanence of these policies, because we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which said prohibited future discrimination. In effect, it said to African Americans, or to working class African Americans, okay, you can now move to these suburbs from which we excluded you in the past. But it's an empty pledge, because without the wealth that white families have, working class families can't afford to buy homes in suburbs where homes cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. So unless we do something to remedy the unconstitutional creation of this wealth gap through housing policy, the Fair Housing Act's promise that future discrimination can't exist will not accomplish as much as it otherwise would.
So then we come to, yes, and I wanted to emphasize that because it became crystal clear as I was reading your book that was the rudiment of the situation that we now have in terms of the income gap or the disparity in income that exists between whites and blacks. But let's talk about, there were instances whereby the scare was created in many of these communities, and what would typically happen in a white community, one would say that blacks are coming, and realtors participated in that. That happened in Boston. We had a thing called B-Burg that took place here in Boston. And I also want to emphasize the Boston Housing Authority was complicit in that desegregation and separate creation of white and black public housing as well. I wanted to emphasize that particular point. And as you pointed out, Cambridge. So it wasn't a southern thing, it wasn't a Midwest thing, it was in the Northeast as well. But let's talk about blockbusting, as we promised, that what it is, how it occurred throughout this country and in communities in these United States.
Okay, I can't resist just adding the one thing to your reference to Boston.
Good, go, please do.
And that is in Boston, for example, and some of your viewers may remember this. Mission Hill, two separate projects. Mission Hill for whites, Mission Hill Extension for African Americans, right across the street from each other. So this was something that the Boston Housing Authority and the federal government did in Boston as well to create segregation. Okay, blockbusting. As the African American community grew in urban areas, the neighborhoods in which they were living became enormously overcrowded. They couldn't get FHA mortgages to move out of those neighborhoods into single-family homes. They couldn't even, or Veterans Administration mortgages if they were veterans. They couldn't even get those mortgages for homes in their own segregated neighborhoods. They were prohibited from getting mortgages there too, and so they were buying homes on contract and not gaining any equity even in the homes that they had in the black neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods became overcrowded, and very frequently everywhere in the country, African Americans tried to move into neighboring white neighborhoods. I'm not talking now about the suburbs. I'm talking about in urban areas where there were neighboring white communities that were not overcrowded. It was to an advantage for a white seller to sell a home to an African American in those neighborhoods, because African Americans' supply of housing was so short that they were willing to pay much more for housing than whites were willing to pay for similar homes. And remember, these were people who could afford to buy homes. African Americans. They weren't poor people. They would bid more for a home in a neighboring white community than a white family were. So even if the neighborhood had a clause in the deed that prohibited resale to African Americans, it was to a white homeowner's advantage to ignore that clause and to sell to an African American at a much higher price than if he sold to another white buyer. Once an African American moved into a neighborhood like that, real estate agents typically descended upon the neighborhood to try to frighten white homeowners to sell to them at a much reduced price by trying to convince them that their neighborhood too was going to become a slum, because they could look at the overcrowded neighborhood from which African Americans came and assume that all neighborhoods where African Americans lived were going to be overcrowded and deteriorated in the way that those neighborhoods in the urban areas, in the more urban areas, were. So they convinced white sellers to sell to them at vastly reduced prices. They used all kinds of techniques to scare white families into selling. They hired black women to wheel baby carriages up and down the block to persuade white homeowners that more and more African Americans were moving in. They hired young African American men to drive up and down the streets with their radios blaring to try to convince white homeowners that the neighborhood would soon become a lower class neighborhood. In a national magazine, one real estate agent even bragged about how he had organized burglaries in the neighborhood in order to convince white families that crime was increasing in their neighborhood. Well, these real estate agents could then buy the homes from panicked whites at far below their fair market value and then resell them to African Americans at much more than their fair market value because, as I said, African Americans were willing to pay more because they had so few choices. And this is the way that many neighborhoods turned from stable middle-class communities into the next round of overcrowded, deteriorating neighborhoods because, again, the overcrowding of African Americans became so great that more and more of them moved into these neighborhoods because it was the only place open to them, and the quality of the neighborhoods deteriorated.
I came across, there was so much that I learned from your book. I had never heard of the Federal Division of Slum Clearance. I never knew such an agency existed. And also you talked about the fact that even though the Brown versus Board of Education versus Topeka, Kansas in 1954 found that with school desegregation was a violation of the Constitution, there was a determination made by the politicians, and I don't recall, and I don't want to overstate whether it was the politicians and the court, that the Brown versus Board of Education didn't apply to housing. So even though there was a victory, even though it came slowly with respect to school desegregation, it said it didn't apply to housing. And can you talk about this Federal Division of Slum Clearance? I had never heard of it before. Could you hear me? Did I lose you there for a minute, Richard? We may be having a little bit of technical difficulty, and hopefully I can get Richard back so we can continue this conversation. But what I am addressing is that the Brown versus Board of Education dealt with school desegregation, and that segregated schools were a violation of the Constitution. And it was determined either by courts and or the political establishment at the time that housing discrimination was in fact something which was not there, it didn't apply to housing. The sum and substance of this, and as we work to get Richard Rothstein back on because he is so knowledgeable in this area, is that this policy of federal and state and municipal policy of segregated housing had much to do with the creation of slums, had much to do with the creation of segregated housing. It had much to do with job elimination it had much to do with the inability of the creation of wealth within the black community. So when we ask ourselves here in the 21st century as to why there is this disparity and we look back in shock, I would suggest to you that you would want to pick up a copy of The Color of Law, because it articulates exactly what happened in the policies that were instituted specifically by the government. And even as Richard Rothstein was saying, there were many communities that were segregated before the government instituted its policies, and they perpetuated it. This was created not only in the housing policy, but it was also created in organizations like the USO during wartime. There were separate places for white and black persons in the military. There were instances where, yes, when at first blacks could not be hired to work at these different jobs, be it in the shipyard, at the Ford plant, etc. But when the necessity came that they needed the bodies, they even said that, fine, we would build something, because oftentimes it wasn't housing. It could have been huts and shacks, but they could not be in white communities because that was the policy that existed both in the public and the private sector. So folks, I'm not speaking out of school here. I mean, this is well documented. It was a policy that was perpetuated, and it is something which I think that we all should come to recognize and understand how things did happen, because if we don't know our history, we are often oftentimes to repeat it, and this is a history that is not a good one for the United States. We can't say that we're a fair and equal country if we have a history which indicates that from the federal government to the courts, there were no remedies that could be employed for persons who were appropriately and rightfully, in many instances, fought for this country and had made a contribution to the building of this country. So this is, that's why I said at the outset, this was a hard program for me to to smile through, simply because it's a troubling subject matter. Does it make one angry? It could. But Martin Luther King spoke to that. He said, don't let a man get you to a low point where you can be in anger. And I'm just paraphrasing his statement. What we have to do is to build upon this and try to correct it. And soon I'll be speaking to the young folks here in Stoughton at the Stoughton High School. And I want to talk to them, that I want to challenge them. They can be the change agents. They can be the ones who write a different history for these United States. That we have a situation whereby folks are judged not by the color of the skin, but the content of their character. That there's opportunities for all. That is not created in terms of what one's gender is or one's personal preferences are, but we're judged on the basis of how we treat one another, on how we act around each other, how we respect each other. And once we can come to that, then programs such as this won't be necessary in order to educate folks. But I think that the starting point is we have to know what the history was. We have to know what the facts were. And even recently, here in Boston, the Boston Globe had an article on race. And in fact, I was reading something earlier today because there's still commentary that's coming forth from that, and people are commenting left and right on that particular issue. But what was somewhat inspiring for me and encouraging for me was that some people were talking about, we need to have this conversation. We know that there is an issue that is around race that is in this city, in this state, in this country, and we need to have that conversation and bring it to the forefront such that we can be able to hopefully eradicate it in one of these centuries going forward. Now, that may not occur while I'm here and living, and those of us who are around me here today. But I know, unfortunately, we may not be able to get to Richard Rothstein back on the air before the end of the program, but when you have Skype, oftentimes there are difficulties. But I want to thank the folks here who introduced and assisted in bringing this together. First, there is, of course, my producer, Roy Cohen, We have Michael Hammond, who is the chief bottle washer here at SMAC. We have Jeffrey Pickett, who is the program director. We have David and we have CJ. David is the maestro in terms of all of the technical things around here. I am so appreciative to be a host on this program. I'm appreciative of being with them in trying to bring you information. And I'm sure some of you may look at this and say it's controversial and Feaster should be doing this. Well, I say to you, if you feel that way, write Roy, don't write me, and let him know how you feel about it. And maybe we can have a conversation, because I'm all about the conversation. I'm not going to sit with anger. I'm going to sit there and be able to have us, as my good friend, the late Lenny Zakem used to say, we can agree to disagree, but let's not be disagreeable. So I hope that this program has been educational. I once again recommend to you to purchase Color of the Law by Richard Rothstein. Richard, I'm going to say thank you to you. I would hope we can have another conversation on this, maybe bring you here, because there's so much in this book. This was the tip of the iceberg in terms of the conversation. But folks, we're coming to the end of Community Forum for this program. I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope that what we've talked about today will at least get your thoughts and your thinking about how we can become a better nation, a better state, a better city, a better country. And I bid you a good day.